The words that I was writing were my heart and soul on the page. It was me sharing what was going on when I was having my down days, in a dark room with the curtains drawn, not wanting to face my family, not wanting to go out on my own because I was too anxious, waiting for cane training, waiting for a guide dog, all these kind of things, worried about the future. And I think from my side, the reason why I was able to kind of do this is before RP and in my earlier kind of years, in my late teens, early 20s, I spent a few years where I was homeless. I'd work as a singer and I'd work away seasonally. And when it was out of season and there wasn't any work on, sometimes I'd have to sofa surf, and I ended up on the street, and there was suicide attempts. I really struggled in my kind of formative years. And that enabled me to kind of gather myself when the whole world was falling apart, when it came down to sight loss, but also kind of be open and share and talk about it.
Welcome to the See-Through Podcast, a podcast that creates transparency on life with a disability through raw conversations with the disability community. I'm your host, Lance Johnson, and I live and podcast with the eye disease, retinitis pigmentosa, or RP for short. In this episode, I talk with Dave Steele, who you may know as the Blind Poet. Dave and I cover his journey of accepting his vision loss, the inspiration behind his poetry, and how embracing his emotions has allowed him to find his audience. But before our interview begins, make sure you subscribe to the channel, follow on social media. The handle is at See-Through-Pod. And if you want bonus episodes and exclusive content, you can now join the See-Through Few over on Patreon. The link is in the show description. But with that all said, here's my talk with Dave. Looks like we're rolling here. All right. Dave Steele, welcome to the See-Through Podcast, man.
Thank you so much for having me, Lance. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, this is interesting because you're my first guest I've had doing this whole video type of recording thing, and it's a little bit of trial and error. Like I'm learning how to use this software as I go, so hopefully everything's smooth.
Happy to be the guinea pig.
You're Dave Steele, but everyone knows you as the Blind Poet.
It's definitely kind of seems that way over the last few years, but yeah, it's something I'm proud of.
But you know what? Dave Steele is a strong name itself, though. Yeah,
I get that a lot. The Steele thing is, yeah. People used to ask me when I worked as a singer years ago. People used to always ask me if that was a stage name, and I was like, no, it's my real name. My son's got a better name. He's Austin J. Steele. He sounds like a superhero.
Oh, Austin Steele. Yeah, that is awesome. Yeah. My nephew's name is Austin. It's a good name.
Secret agent. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, we're here to talk about a bunch of things, man. A wide variety. Some things you always talk about, and some things that maybe you haven't talked about out there. So I guess for starters, if someone's listening and they're not too familiar with you, how about you introduce yourself?
Yeah, you kind of done it for me. So my name's Dave Steele. I am from Manchester in the UK. And as I said, over the last couple of years, I've become to be known as the Blind Poet. And the reason for that is I write poetry that people with low vision and blindness kind of relate to. It helps them feel like they're less alone. And they also use my words as a way for them to describe how they're feeling to their loved ones and family and friends. And it's kind of become more than poetry. It's more about supporting people through, kind of living with low blindness and showing that you can still do amazing things despite any lack of sight in your eyes, and trying to deal with some of these misconceptions as well that we all live with. Yeah,
definitely. It definitely is appreciated by, the RP community and low vision community, because I would say you have a really strong voice in our community in terms of your poetry connects to a lot of people. And I want to talk about the origins of your poetry. Were you always a poet?
No, absolutely not. In fact, I've written now, it's 4 books and over 800 poems in 7 years. And before I started to lose my sight, I worked as a singer. So I'd written a couple of songs here and there nothing really, anything special, and written a couple of pieces of poetry, but just the odd poem here and there over the years. And it wasn't until really, I was diagnosed with RP, or officially diagnosed with RP, nearly 8 years ago, that the poetry literally just started to kind of pour out of me.
So you're diagnosed with RP, so retinitis pigmentosa. That's what I have. If you listen to this podcast, you've heard me say those two words a million times. So,
yeah.
So you were a late diagnosis, right? You had no, like, whenever you were diagnosed, did you have an idea that you had something wrong with your vision?
Yeah, kind of. I was in denial for a long, long time. I first heard about RP when I was probably about 7 years old. My sister was the first one to be diagnosed in our family officially with it in the early 80s.
Yeah.
But I was always told, we've got this condition, sight loss condition, retinitis pigmentosa in the family, and the chances are it's not going to affect you till very much later on in life, and just to kind of get on with your life. And I did that. Worked as a singer for many years, but probably had the early onset of RP from my early 20s, struggling with a night blindness, but it was very slight night blindness. It was just kind of that adjustment from light to dark.
Yeah.
It'd take me a little bit longer, especially working as a singer, where I'm kind of backstage a lot and having to deal with bright lights as well on stage. I kind of had to make a little bit more of an adjustment. But other than that, I felt like I was, perfectly fine. But it wasn't until, as I said, nearly 8 years ago now, when I was just in my late 30s, that I really couldn't deny it any longer. I went for a routine eye exam, and when they looked in the back of my eyes, they saw that there was a lot of pigment there, and immediately I was told to stop driving. And then, like 2 weeks later, I was diagnosed as being what they call severely sight impaired here in the UK, which is legally blind. So yeah, it was a big shock to the system.
So when your initial diagnosis, you were considered legally blind.
Yeah. I skipped that partially sighted stage, But that's the strange thing with and I talk about this a lot, and this is really important with a condition like retinitis pigmentosa, where it is very gradual loss for periods, and then you have kind of dips depending on the gene mutation that's in the family, because there are lots of different types of RP. But the type that we have in my family is autosomal dominant, so there's a clear trace, 1 in 2 chance every time a child is born. But the thing is with vision is your brain does this really strange thing, and I think you'll relate to this, is subconsciously it fills in the blanks for you.
Yeah.
So when you walk into a room, you'll subconsciously scan the room, and for what your eyes can't see, your brain kind of fills in those blanks. So it's not until you're actually tested in those kind of clinical conditions, as doing like a peripheral field test and all those kind of things, that you actually realize how little you can actually see. And that was certainly the case with me. I thought I could see more than I could. And it wasn't until I went for that kind of routine eye exam, when they kind of did the peripheral vision test, and I was sat there waiting for the lights to flash and holding the button, and I wasn't seeing anything. And I was literally not clicking the button, and the test finished, and I'd clicked a few times, and I knew that I could feel it coming on, and feeling this kind of realization that, all of a sudden my life is going to change.
Whew. Yeah, those field vision tests, they don't make you feel good about yourself.
No. That was a real kind of it was a real moment. I don't know if you've ever seen. There's a film by a British director called Guy Ritchie, who used to be married to Madonna, and I was watching. It was one of his first films, a film called Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, and I was actually watching it again for the first time in ages a couple of days ago. And there's this scene at the beginning of the film where one of the characters loses a fortune, all his friends' money, in a card game. And as he's walking away from the card game, the whole kind of room's spinning and everything's kind of going in slow motion. And I always remember kind of that. I think about that film when I think about that moment of being diagnosed, of coming out of the doctor's, or the optician's kind of surgery room, where my wife, she wasn't even my wife then, but she was my fiance. We were just saving to get married, and my son Austin, who was about 8-9 months old at the time, sat in his car seat. We're waiting outside the room, thinking it was kind of a routine eye test, and me walking out and having to tell them that our lives were going to change quite dramatically, and it was a real kind of scary moment. Yeah,
that is very scary. So, initial thoughts, like what was your age again when you were diagnosed?
I was 38.
38. All right. So you're 38, and then you're engaged, you have a fiance, you have a son, and you have this career, and then you get diagnosed, and you know that your sister had RP, so you were kind of in denial about potentially having it yourself.
Absolutely.
So then you're just going from 0 to 100. You're officially diagnosed. There's something about like being officially diagnosed versus just not going to a doctor and just kind of, because I haven't been to the eye doctor in a while. And I'm a little bit nervous too, because I'm afraid that, I will be classified something differently.
Yeah, I understand that.
But what do you think it is about that like official diagnosis that kind of that makes your head spin and kind of?
I think it's that realization, as I was saying there, about like the brain kind of filling in the blanks. I think when you get that realization and you have that official diagnosis, that your brain doesn't fill in the blanks anymore. For a start, you start noticing, seeing in a different way. I mean, I went from that kind of diagnosis to actually losing all my peripheral vision in the first kind of 8 months after that diagnosis. My vision dipped. And a big part of that is kind of stress of the situation. I think stress, and eye pressure and everything else has a massive impact. And also, what I've learned from kind of speaking to other people and other family members that have RP is with the type of RP that we have in our family, it kind of follows patterns. I actually spoke to an uncle of mine from my mum's side who was completely blind with RP a few years ago, and he was telling me about how his kind of sight had deteriorated, and it was mirroring mine exactly on the age of kind of official diagnosis to kind of dips and everything else. And I said to him, when did you lose, kind of the rest of your sight? And he said late 40s, and I'm 46 now. And I was like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
And it kind of put a time on it. So yeah, it does kind of, when you get that official diagnosis and you go down the process, you notice things more. And obviously with me, my whole world changes in the fact that I was working in car sales at the time. And when I told my employer that I was being declared severely sight impaired or legally blind, they let me go. They let me, I lost my job because I couldn't do test drives and do that big part of car sales anymore. And they let me go, and I found myself unemployed, and I applied to get help through the support system because I'm quite an optimist. I always thought that, I'm not the only one that's been through this. There's been loads of people that have been through this. So surely there's got to be a system in place for people like us. This is what I was saying to my wife at the time. Surely there's got to be a system in place for people like us. It's nothing to worry about. We'll make some phone calls. We'll get this sorted. We'll be okay. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The system that we had at the time in the UK, in order to kind of get financial support, there was an 9 month waiting list of the process of being able to receive a first payment, of being actually going through the system and being assessed that you actually, were needing or at the right level to receive these kind of payments, and you were being assessed by people who didn't know anything about the condition. Which is crazy, really, because really when you get that certification from a retinal specialist, you'd think that would be enough, but no. So those first 8 or 9 months were really, really tough. We had to feed our kids on food parcels. I lost my job. I was struggling with anxiety and depression because not just because of the sight that I was losing, but also the financial pressure I was putting on my young family. I had 2 stepsons. I have a daughter in Scotland from a previous relationship. My wife and she was my fiancée then, Amy. We had Austin, who was young. We couldn't afford the rent in the house we were staying in. We were saving to get married. Everything kind of fell apart, and we were really struggling for a while. And it was tough times, but it was speaking to other people like yourself and jumping online that actually kind of was the start of me turning things around to kind of where I am now.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you were diagnosed and you were just hit with this whole life's change. Your job is, you get let go, which isn't even really legal, is it?
No, it was funny the way they went about it was quite kind of sly. What they did was I think the general manager let me go.
Yeah.
And then, like a week later, I got a phone call from someone in the HR department, and they invited me in, and they offered me a role, but it was a role that was temporary, and it was a role that was never ever going to work out. It was kind of like a place that made up for me, doing a job that was never ever going to actually work out.
Yeah.
To kind of tick a box. So I knew what they were up to. So I initially kind of, once that had kind of happened, I then started applying for positions that I could normally do standing on my head. And every time I got on the phone with someone and I mentioned about my low vision, that was the end of the conversation. Phones would get put down. It was crazy.
Wow.
So I even actually, this is how crazy it was in those early days. And I remember having this experience I'm about to tell you about, and actually being in floods of tears afterwards because I was so frustrated. I went for an interview with a very well-known, I'm not going to mention any names, but a very well-known sight loss charity here in the UK for a position called an eye clinic liaison officer. And an eye clinic liaison officer is someone who speaks to people who have been newly diagnosed and helps them get the support that they need, helps them make the links to things like employment support, benefit support, well-being and mental health support, anything that they need to kind of get them through the process. And when I got interviewed, I got to like the final interview. I had a couple of interviews and they loved me, and got to the final stage, and then they turned around and said to me, "Oh, we don't feel like you're in a position to support other people." And I was like, "How can you say that about, you don't know me, you don't know what I'm made of."
Yeah.
And I think I've actually proved that with everything I've done in the future, that actually I can support a lot of people. So, but, I needed to go through this process, I think, to get me to where I am now, and, all the things that I've done since. And it's, I think, it's our scars and the tough things and the dark days that we go through that actually give us the strength and armor to face the things that we yet to face going forward.
I agree, definitely. And that's always what I find the most, what pumps me up the most when I talk to people on this podcast, is hearing them go from point A to point B, have this like character arc of, it's kind of like there's a before you're diagnosed, and then there's a diagnosis, and then there's this down period where you're learning about yourself and you're just experiencing all these new emotions and you're trying to accept it. And then there's a period of acceptance, and then you start embracing it, your disability. And then once you start embracing, your disability, is when you're like, that's when things start actually working for you. It seems like a mental thing, right?
Absolutely. I think every stage is important, though.
Yeah.
One of the things that really used to get to me about our community sometimes is people who use the word pity party. Hate that saying. Yeah. And the reason being is, I think like people used to always say to me, "Oh, when you get further down the line of this kind of journey or whatever, or down the progression of acceptance and everything else, your poetry will change." And it has done to a certain degree, but I will always remember those early days and talk about those early days and talk about the good days, the dark days. I think there's great strength in being able to talk about your hard times, your weaknesses, talk about anxiety, talk about depression, because there's always someone at the beginning of their journey that needs the help the most. And some people within our community, I'm sure we all know them, are almost like alcoholics who can't stand to be around people who are drinking, in the way that they can't listen to someone sharing their experiences at the beginning of their journey because they've moved past it. That's not necessarily the right thing to do. I think we should always remember that no matter where we're at, never to judge, because there's always someone at the beginning of their journey or having a tough time. And that's something I'm always focused on whenever I write.
I really, personally, like, you're the first person to address that, because I'm coming from this weird, I'm like in the middle. So like I have RP. Mm-hmm. I'm not legally blind yet. but my mom has RP, my sister has RP, my mom is legally blind. So I know I'm most likely going to be legally blind at some point in my lifetime. And I'm grateful for the vision I have right now, obviously. But there is something to knowing that your future is going to be different. Your vision is going to be different in the future. And having to experience that yourself and having a career. And I work as a video editor, and my career is very visual based. So it's like my career is kind of up in the air. And then it's like, I'm married. I want to have children. So I want to be able to provide for my wife. I want to provide for my future children. And I also want to be a good parent, and just, and you can get in your head, the future can seem, what should seem very exciting can all of a sudden, if you hang your hat too much on your visual impairment, it can kind of suck the joy out of the thought of the future.
I understand that. But at the same time, I think, for us to kind of do what we want to do with our future when we know we're facing something like this is, first of all, there's no guarantees that anyone is going to go completely blind, because we know the percentages of people who see nothing to those that don't. And most people who are legally blind have some kind of useful vision. And it's crazy how, even with just a little bit of sight, what you can achieve with that. So there's no guarantees as far as tomorrow's concerned. But also at the same time, I think you can understand as well that when we are losing something, it also makes us appreciate the sight that we've got that much more and make us use it more. So we do have to adjust and work harder. But at the same time, we actually see a lot more than people who are fully sighted, because we actually cherish it more.
I agree.
And I think that's a gift. That's one of the things it's taught me. It's a real gift to be able to live like that. Because I feel like I'm living a lot better than I did before I started to lose my sight.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah. And I do find myself, sometimes I'll be out with my wife somewhere, and I'll just stop and I'll say, let me just look around real fast. Let me just kind of, and I'll like intentionally kind of embrace the visuals of what I'm looking at, just so, because I don't know, I find myself wanting to experience more and see more, while I can, and who knows what my future vision is going to be like. But yeah, it has changed my perspective. If I'm somewhere and there's a beautiful sunset and a pretty view, I'm going to stare at it more intentionally,
And if you go through your life always doing that, how amazing is that?
Yeah.
That's a cool way to look at the world, to look at life.
Yeah. So, but I appreciate you writing from that initial diagnosis viewpoint, because some people aren't at the stage you are at. They're not at the stage that my mom is at, being legally blind, and they're having to experience their emotions of knowing what their future is going to entail, or embracing a new diagnosis, for the people who are the first in their family to be diagnosed with RP. And I think that I don't know, that just your poetry around, because are you saying, all right, let me backtrack a little bit. So the people who, you had that analogy about the alcoholic not wanting to be around people drinking. Are you talking about other visually impaired people listening to your poetry that is kind of, the subject matter is about anxiety and depression of being diagnosed? They don't want to hear it. Is that what you're talking about?
Definitely, 100%. Yeah, when I first got diagnosed, when I first got diagnosed, when I first started writing the poetry, when I was writing the first book, Stand By Me RP, and posting a lot of these poems online, although I was getting a lot of support from within the blind community, a lot of people saying the same things that I still get to this day. It's like you're reading my mind. I really needed to hear this today. I'm using your words to help me explain to my loved ones and my family how I feel, and it's so valuable. But at the same time, I was also getting messages from people saying, you need to stop talking about this. You got to stop talking about the negative of living with low vision and blindness and going blind. You've got to stop talking about anxiety and depression. It's putting blind people in a bad light. And a lot of that came from the UK. And the reason being, I think, is here in the UK, we're a little bit more reserved in talking about our feelings.
Okay.
There's a saying, your wife will know this, called stiff upper lip. It's that, put on a brave front and don't talk about what's actually going on in your heart. And that's not me. And certainly I think that's why my poetry's always been received well in places like America and Australia, because people, on your side are a little bit more confident and open about sharing what's going on. And I think that's great. But here in the UK, but yeah, initially I did, get a lot of that. And it used to hurt me at the beginning. And I remember, like, in the early days, feeling, any little bit of criticism, really taking it to heart, because the words that I was writing were my heart and soul on the page. It was me sharing what was going on when I was having my down days, in a dark room with the curtains drawn, not wanting to face my family, not wanting to go out on my own because I was too anxious, waiting for cane training, waiting for a guide dog, all these kind of things, worried about my future. And I think from my side, the reason why I was able to kind of do this is before RP and in my earlier kind of years, in my late teens, early 20s, I spent a few years where I was homeless. I'd work as a singer and I'd work away seasonally. And when it was out of season and there wasn't any work on, sometimes I'd have to sofa surf, and I ended up on the street, and there was suicide attempts. I really struggled in my kind of formative years. And that enabled me to kind of gather myself when the whole world was falling apart, when it came down to sight loss, but also kind of be open and share and talk about it. And it's back to what I was saying at the beginning about everything kind of happens for a reason. The things that we go through in our past kind of give us the ability to face things going forward. It's the same with the poetry. If I hadn't worked all those years as a singer, I wouldn't understand rhythm and flow, and I wouldn't have been able to write the way that I do. So I'm a great believer that kind of these things from my past have helped me kind of do what I do now and shape my future.
Oh, yeah, most certainly. And that makes total sense with singing and rhythm, and just how that would affect your pacing and rhythm of your poetry.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that's, who are other people to tell you what art you can create? You're the artist, you're the sole creator, And this is the thing. And this is what I'm learning to be more accepting of. Not everyone's going to like what you do, And
Absolutely,
and that's okay, because even the most popular artists in the world have a ton of haters,
Who would I be to say that, I
Exactly.
speak for everyone with living with blindness and low vision? That's just ridiculous.
Because you have artists who sell out arenas, and then there's people who hate those artists. But yeah, they're still selling out arenas.
Absolutely.
So it's like, hey, it's okay. If not everyone's your audience, that's fine.
People used to say to me as well, how many poems can you write about blindness or low vision? I'm like, well, how many songs can you write about love?
Oh, yeah, endless.
Yeah, exactly. A certain line will hit someone differently.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It'll just kind of trigger something in them. And I always get that, I've never written a piece of poetry that's taken me longer than 20 minutes to write. Every time I write them, it's like someone sat on my shoulders, kind of speaking the words. I just kind of get my phone out and I get an idea in my head or an opening line, and it just kind of comes. But to be able to do that and then use social media to send it around the world to someone who, needs to hear it that day, that's just something that I'm so grateful for, and I never take for granted.
Yeah, and those people who probably ask you that, how many poems can you write? They probably aren't creative artists themselves. So it's like, take it with a grain of salt. It's like, who are
absolutely.
If it was a friend of yours who was a very successful poet, then maybe you would be like, yeah. But it's like, come on. If you don't have skin in the game, it's like, don't try to. I don't know. I just don't understand. Like, we don't give critiques on, like, let's say you have an accountant friend.
I know.
We're not like, are you sure? Like, you couldn't be a better accountant? Or, it's just like, it's the arts is just in particular because it's so subjective, and we're out. Yeah.
It was never really like, obviously you say I've come to be known as the blind poet now, but like at the beginning, for me, it was never really about the art form of poetry as such.
Yeah.
It was just that thing of poetry and music, as we said, music, song lyrics and poetry, it's kind of the same thing, and especially the way I write. It has that ability to kind of draw you in differently than just kind of speaking. And we've all got, and I can remember having these thought processes right at the beginning. We've all got a song that has gotten us through a dark time in our lives, or a breakup or something like that. We turn to music in those kind of times to listen and feel the lyrics.
Yeah.
And I just remember thinking when I had this idea of doing it that way, that it was just obvious. It was just a great way of being able to kind of affect people and support people and help people. And my wife actually summed it up best. She said to me, Dave, she said, what you try and do is you try and be there for other people in the way that you wanted someone to be there for you right at the beginning. And I was like, yeah, that's right. That's kind of why I do what I do. So now when I'm having my dark days, or, as I still do, we all have tough days. If I'm getting frustrated or I have a dip in my vision, my first thought now is not, oh, woe is me, blah, blah, whatever's going on. My first thought in that is, how can I use what I'm feeling today to put that into a piece of poetry that's going to help somebody else?
Oh, I love that. And I think about that too. That's kind of why I had this podcast,
Absolutely. It's the same thing. It's what we all do. Anyone that puts themselves out there within the kind of blind community or in, anything like this, in disability or anything in general, is, how can we share our experiences to help other people?
Yeah. When I growing up, I knew one visually impaired person, legally blind person. That was my mom. And I knew no one else in the community. And now I start this podcast and I'm creating this content that I'm like digging deep into my own psyche and others and listening to other stories. And I feel so much more intelligent on this subject and so much more comfortable in my own skin. But I had to do it myself and that's just kind of the age of the internet too. But like when I was in high school, there weren't really podcasts or anything like that. But it's like, if I can make a podcast and it's, let's say my high school self would discover it and then they get something out of it, that's who I'm doing this for,
Absolutely.
So
and isn't it always the artists that we kind of find ourselves drawn to? If you think about musicians or singers, songwriters, isn't it those songwriters and singers and musicians that really open themselves up and share their deepest and darkest and, every part of their lives in their art that we find ourselves drawn to?
I agree. And that's especially for me. I've always liked, musical artists or films that kind of deal with human emotion and they're not afraid to explore, sadness or
absolutely,
or feelings of, depression and whatnot. That's just always personally what's drawn to me. I guess you could consider me if you looked at my the music I listen to or the movies I like, you would think I was like a sad person. But it's just what I connect to.
You see, that's funny as well, because the way certain things are perceived. Actually, there's some music people will hear and they think, oh, that's sad music, but it isn't actually.
Yeah.
There's a band from the UK, I'm sure you'll be familiar with them, called Radiohead.
Yeah, love Radiohead.
When people listen to Radiohead, you don't really get it straight away. They think, oh, that's sad music. Oh, that you're just depressing that. And actually, it's the complete opposite. It's joyful. It's beautiful. It's strength.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I agree.
I get that.
Yeah, I love Radiohead.
Yeah, me too.
And they're a perfect example of an artist I would listen to. And if that's not your cup of tea and you hear me in my room listening to Radiohead and then you read the lyrics, you might and that's the thing, art is subjective. Like what I just said, and not everyone's going to be your target audience. As great as Radiohead is, there's people out there who don't like Radiohead. And,
absolutely,
so that's kind of funny when you put it like that, it's like, but all right. So you have this new life. You're a poet now, and that's unique. Not many people are poets, but you are an author. You have books out that involve your poetry, right?
Well, all the books are poetry. So so far, I mean, obviously the new book's out this week, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, but Stand By Me RP, when that was released, it was literally, the way it kind of came about was after my diagnosis, when I turned to the poetry, I started posting it online, and people were messaging me saying all those same kind of things about how it was helping them. And that encouraged me. And then from that, after posting them on a lot of the support groups for RP and other conditions, I started then a Facebook page, and then from that, people were saying to me after I'd written 100 poems, oh, you need to put these in a book. And they then started a GoFundMe campaign, and in February 2016 I released Stand By Me RP.
And that's a collection of your poetry, right?
Yeah, it's like 75, 80 poems in the first book. Nice. And I released that, self-published it, and it's a really strange story, this, and I'll tell you now, the way kind of things happen about, like, when I talk about my before I started to lose my sight and how I had times where I was homeless. There was a lot of years where I felt like I was kind of almost cursed in a certain way, where nothing would ever work out right. Jobs wouldn't work out right. Life wouldn't work out right. Relationships wouldn't work out right. I was going down the wrong path. And all of a sudden, when I went through that initial stage with my diagnosis and I found the poetry, it was really spooky how things kind of happened at the right time and in the right place. And when Stand By Me RP came out, it was February 2016. February is RP Awareness Month, as you probably know. And I released it in February, and I remember getting a message from one of my supporters in Canada saying the book's gone live on Amazon. And then the next day we got up, and myself and my wife were celebrating, and we went to drive out to go and get some lunch to kind of celebrate the book coming out. And on the way, my phone rang. My wife was driving. I'm in the passenger seat at the front, obviously, and my phone rang. I answered the phone, and it was Guide Dogs, the UK charity Guide Dogs. I've been on the waiting list for 18 months for a guide dog. The day my book came out, they rang me to say, "Oh, we found you a match.
Wow,
you're going to meet a guide dog in a week." And I kind of told my wife, and it was like, "Oh my god!" Like double whammy, the book and the guide dog in the same day, and like floods of tears. But yeah, it just kind of it snowballed from there. The book, the Stand By Me RP, became the #1 European poetry release on Amazon in both America and Australia in its first day.
Wow.
And then volume 2 and volume 3 did it. So no, not its first day, sorry, in the first week. And volume 2 and volume 3 did it on its first day. The same thing, #1 European poetry release.
Okay, so there's three volumes. And if you go to theblindpoet.net, you can buy.
Yeah, everything's on there. You can search for them on Amazon. One of the really cool things you can do now, which is once again the power of the internet and something I'm really proud of, is if you literally go onto Google and type in "The Blind Poet," the first thing that comes up is a lot of my work, and it's really quite cool considering how many the famous blind poets have been. Actually, on my arm here, you can't see it because I've got a long sleeve top on. I've got lots of tattoos on my arms, and a lot of them are all to do with my kind of low vision and blindness and the work that I do. And the first big piece I got was a portrait of a Greek philosopher by the name of Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he was known as the blind poet. So I've got that and Stand By Me RP written underneath the picture of Homer. And my son often says to me now, Austin will say, "Oh, so Dad, he's the old blind poet and you're the new one now," which I think is pretty cool.
Hey, I'll take that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But the 3 books, theblindpoet.net is a great place to start with all the links and things, but you can literally search it. Which is really cool.
And you also have a children's book or children's poetry, right?
Yeah, it's literally just, I'll tell you this is really cool. Right at this very moment, right now, I think I heard Austin get in. He's downstairs waiting. The books have just been sent. My first copies of the book have just been UPS'd from America, and they arrived early this afternoon. And I've not opened the parcel yet to actually see the books for the first time. I'm waiting for Austin to come back so he can do it because he is the maker.
How exciting!
So as soon as we're done recording this, we're going to go down and open the books. But the books are officially out now. By the time I've done it all and seen them, we're giving the kind of green light for the pre-orders to start shipping, and everyone will be receiving their books. But once again, they're from you can order them from theblindpoet.net. And the books are Austin's Amazing Adventures, children's short poetic stories aimed at kind of elementary school kids from like the age of 5 to 11. And they are short poetic stories, so told in poetry, and about a young visually impaired boy based on my son Austin and his best friend, who's his guide dog. And basically, what the books are about and the way they're going to go in the future is something I'm really, really proud of. They're about a young visually impaired boy going to a mainstream school, and it's about his interactions with his friends and the challenges he faces. And it's about normalizing disability and blindness and helping children who are going through it, are living with blindness and low vision, to have a character they can really relate to, but also helping those other children understand that actually, despite these challenges and differences, that these kids are just like them. And I think it's something that's really needed. Yeah,
I love that, because what's great about what your book, your Stand By Me RP, and this Austin's Amazing Adventures is it's a wide audience. It can reach a lot of people. Like, I have nieces and nephews. They could read this book and learn about, visual impairments or blindness. And then if you expand the universe to more things, you're reaching other people, and I think that's important to not only talk to people in the visually impaired community, but also the general population.
What we've done with it as well, which is really quite cool, we've done a couple of things that are very different. First of all, when we did our research, although there was a few books out there with children with disabilities and stuff, there wasn't anything in that kind of poetry style. And then there needs to be more children with disabilities featured in children's stories. There's a great need for that. But we've done things slightly differently. So the books have been beautifully illustrated by a very talented artist who's also a school teacher by the name of Sue Green, that I'm working with here in the UK. Where the illustrations are in the books, you've also got image descriptions on each illustration. And at the end of each story, you have what we call talking points, guided learning questions, open questions. So if someone's reading at home with a child or they're doing it in school, we have a set questions where you go through them, and it asks things like, how would you feel if you were in Austin's, situation with, a certain part of the story, or how could you help a person who is losing their sight? And it's about, encouraging those conversations. And also we're doing a thing where there's going to be actually downloadable teaching material. And we're going to actually have these books within the schools here in the UK and in the States, where they're actually going to be done as part of a lesson to encourage inclusivity and get kids talking and erase those misconceptions that we know exist, like, oh, you don't look blind, and all those kind of things.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was excited about when you told that to me. I was like, oh, this is could be such a good educational tool to reach a wide audience. So that's awesome.
Every parent that I've spoke to, like, for example, my sister-in-law, Kath, she lost her son a couple of months ago. He passed away at the age of 18 to a condition called Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
I'm familiar.
Which is a terminal muscle wasting disease. Josh died a couple of months ago. And when I initially started talking about these books, she said, I wish there'd have been something like Josh when he was a kid that he could really relate to. And one of the future stories, I'm actually going to put a young Josh in the story and talk about wheelchair use. And the idea of the story is there's a new kid in the class that everyone's going to be introduced to, and Austin hears about that we've got a new pupil starting today, and the door opens, and in comes Josh in his wheelchair, and Austin, being a child with low vision, wants to help Josh settle in and he becomes a friend to him, and I think that's especially doing it in that kind of poetry style. It's a really great way of really showing kids and breaking down some of these needless barriers.
Yeah, they are needless barriers, and that's kind of why on this podcast I talk to a lot of people with visual impairments, but I talk to anyone with a disability, because I think there is a lot of crossover. And
but it's not even just that, is it? It's not even, I mean, you could take it wider than disability. With the last 18 months, 2 years now, with the pandemic, with how the world's changed with COVID, the whole world has stepped into the shoes of people with disability, because people around the world have had to deal with, for the first time, things that we've dealt with for a long time. Social anxiety, isolation, having to think a little bit more before stepping outside your door. So, these books in the future can talk about anything like that in that kind of way. And it's certainly something that I really intend to do.
Awesome. Yeah, I really support that, and I look forward to that. And you can buy these books, Stand By Me RP, Austin's Amazing Adventure, theblindpoet.net is your website?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, yeah. And the website's all obviously fully accessible for people who have low vision and blindness, but yeah, it's great. And there's all the other work that I'm doing on there as well, speaking at events and the campaigns that I've been involved with recently.
Well, I think that does it, man. First interview, video interview, accomplished. I'd say it was fun. I think it.
Yeah, we did it.
So thanks, Dave, for coming on the See Through podcast. That conversation, I loved it, man.
My pleasure.
So I look forward to keeping in touch with you, man.
Absolutely. Thank you.